Evelina's stepmom sneered when Evelina inherited nothing. But then the Duke of Blackwood entered the room. His chilling words sliced through the tension. "She inherits me, and I own everything." The room fell silent. But who exactly does the Duke think he is? And what does this sudden claim mean for Evelina? Is this a cruel joke or a life-changing proposal? Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this historic romantic tale, I'd be so grateful for a like or a subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories of love, longing, and history. And if you're up for it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and it always brings a smile to my face. Chapter 1. The Will Reading. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. Evelina Whitford sat perfectly still on the hard-backed chair near the cold fireplace of Fairfield Manor's drawing room, her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight despite the chair's uncomfortable angle. She had learned long ago that stillness was a form of invisibility, and invisibility was survival. Across from her, Lady Margaret Whitford reclined on the plush settee like a queen holding court, her daughters arranged on either side of her like carefully positioned ornaments. Beatrice, at 21, wore new black silk that rustled with every breath. Constance, 19, had matching fabric, though cut in a slightly different style. Their mourning clothes had been commissioned from London the moment Lord Whitford's health had taken its final turn. Evelina's own dress was 5 years old, originally purchased when a distant cousin had died and had been let out twice to accommodate the subtle changes in her figure. The alterations were visible if one looked closely. Slightly puckered seams at the waist, a faint discoloration where the old stitching had been. The fabric had faded from true black to something closer to charcoal, and the style was decidedly out of fashion. She wondered if anyone in the room noticed. Probably not. They rarely noticed her at all. The November rain drummed against the windows, creating a rhythm that matched the hollow beating of Evelina's heart. Beyond the glass, the gardens of Fairfield Manor disappeared into grey mist. 3 days since they had buried her father. 3 days of this suffocating atmosphere, of Margaret's barely concealed satisfaction, of her half-sister's careful avoidance of her gaze. "The solicitor is late," Margaret announced, her voice cutting through the quiet. She consulted the ornate clock on the mantelpiece with obvious displeasure. Most inconsiderate, given the circumstances. Standards are slipping everywhere. Even the professional classes seem to have forgotten proper decorum in this post-industrial age. Beatrice murmured agreement. Constance said nothing, but her fingers worried at the black ribbon on her dress. Evelina's eyes drifted to her father's chair, the leather wingback positioned near the window where he had spent his final months, watching the estate he would soon leave behind. Even now, 3 days after his death, no one had dared to sit in it. In life, he had never invited Evelina to sit near him either. She had been permitted in his presence occasionally, always standing, always silent, always aware that she existed in his household by sufferance rather than right. The clock struck 4, and as if summoned by the chime, hurried footsteps sounded in the hallway. Mr. Pemberton, the family solicitor, appeared in the doorway, his coat dampened by rain, his spectacles fogged from the transition between the cold exterior and the slightly warmer interior. He carried a leather satchel that he clutched protectively against his chest. "Lady Margaret, my sincerest apologies for the delay." He removed his hat, revealing thinning grey hair plastered to his skull. "The roads from London are nearly impassable with the rain. I was forced to—" Yes, Margaret interrupted with a dismissive wave. "You're here now. Shall we proceed? I'm certain we all wish to have this unpleasant business concluded." Mr. Pemberton's eyes swept the room, landing briefly on Evelina before skittering away. That, too, was familiar. People rarely looked at her directly. She had become expert at reading the edges of their vision, interpreting what they thought of her by how quickly they looked away. The solicitor settled himself at the writing desk, extracted several rain-dampened documents from his satchel, and arranged them with nervous precision. He cleared his throat twice before speaking. "The last will and testament of Edmund Whitford, Lord of Fairfield Manor, written in sound mind on the 15th of July, 1868, 4 months before his death." Evelina's hands tightened in her lap. 4 months during which he had been confined to his chair, his body failing but his mind still sharp. 4 months during which he might have summoned her, might have spoken to her, might have acknowledged her existence in some meaningful way. He had not. Mr. Pemberton read in a methodical drone, his voice rising and falling with practiced legal cadence. Fairfield Manor and its surrounding farms, over 2,000 acres of Hampshire countryside, were to pass to Beatrice's future husband, whoever that might be, with the provision that Beatrice would retain ownership should she remain unmarried. The London townhouse in Mayfair, along with its furnishings and an annual income of £3,000, was bequeathed to Constance. The investment portfolio, carefully accumulated over decades, was to be divided equally between his legitimate daughters. Evelina felt the words like small cuts. Legitimate. The implication hung in the air. There was an illegitimate daughter present, and she was something else entirely. Mr. Pemberton continued. Personal items were distributed with care. Lord Whitford's pocket watch to a military friend, his hunting rifles to a neighbour's son, his collection of books on estate management to a cousin. Even his favourite horse was mentioned, to be given to the stable-master who had cared for it these many years. For Evelina, nothing. Not her mother's wedding ring, which she knew existed because she had seen it once, pressed between the pages of a book in her father's study. Not the small watercolours her mother had painted of the estate gardens, which hung in a lesser hallway where no one of importance ever walked. Not even a token gesture, a book, a trinket, a single shilling to acknowledge that she had existed under his roof for 23 years. Nothing. The word rang in Evelina's mind with terrible finality. She had expected this, had known it would be thus, and yet the reality of hearing it spoken aloud in Mr. Pemberton's detached voice created a hollowness in her chest that threatened to consume her. Well, Lady Margaret said into the silence that followed the reading's conclusion. Her voice carried a satisfaction that she didn't bother to disguise. Well, Mr. Pemberton, I suppose that settles the matter of my late husband's earlier indiscretion. Evelina's jaw tightened. Earlier indiscretion, as if she were a youthful mistake, a forgotten debt, a regrettable transaction. Margaret turned to look at her directly for the first time that afternoon, and her smile was cold. She has received exactly what she deserves. Nothing. Beatrice studied her hands. Constance's cheeks flushed pink, but she said nothing. They had never been actively cruel to Evelina, had never joined their mother in her casual torments, but neither had they ever been kind. They had simply looked away, year after year, until looking away had become second nature. Evelina rose from her chair with the careful grace she had perfected over the years. She would not run. She would not cry. She had given Margaret the satisfaction of her tears once, at age 7, when she had been told she could not attend Beatrice's birthday celebration. She had learned then that tears only fed the woman's cruelty. "If you'll excuse me," Evelina said quietly, her voice steady despite the roaring in her ears. She turned toward the door, already planning her retreat to the servants' quarters, where Margaret had informed her she would be staying now that her father was gone. She would pack her few belongings, the worn dresses, the hidden books she had collected over the years, the sketch pencils she had purchased, with coins saved from managing the household accounts. Perhaps she could find a position as a governess, though without references it would be difficult. Perhaps the door swung open before she reached it. The man who entered was tall enough that he had to duck slightly beneath the doorframe. Rain had darkened his hair to black, and his morning clothes were perfectly tailored, emphasizing broad shoulders and a lean, powerful frame. But it was his face that arrested Evelina's movement, sharply handsome, with high cheekbones and a jaw that might have been carved from marble. His eyes, ice blue and penetrating, swept the room with the confidence of someone accustomed to command. The room fell silent. Even the rain seemed to quiet. Lady Margaret rose from the settee, her expression shifting rapidly from irritation to recognition to something approaching nervousness. "Your Grace," she said, her voice suddenly honey-sweet. "We were not expecting, that is. What an unexpected honor." The Duke of Blackwood, for Evelina, knew who he must be, even having never met him. There was no mistaking that bearing. That presence did not acknowledge Margaret's flustered greeting. His ice-blue eyes continued their scan of the room, passing over the solicitor, the half-sisters, the empty chair, until they landed on Evelina. She felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing. No one had looked at her so directly in years. She found she could not look away. "I see I've arrived at an opportune moment," Alexander Sinclair said. His voice was cold, precise, each word clipped with aristocratic authority. He turned to Margaret. "Lady Margaret, you've made an error in your accounting." Margaret's false smile faltered. "Your Grace, I assure you." The will was quite clear. "Mr. Pemberton has just finished reading." "Miss Whitford inherits me," Alexander interrupted, his voice cutting through her protest like a blade through silk. "And I own everything." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Evelina's mind struggled to process what she had heard. Inherits him? What could that possibly mean? She had never met this man, had never even heard his name mentioned in connection with her father, and yet he stood here, in the drawing room of Fairfield Manor, making pronouncements about her inheritance with absolute certainty. Mr. Pemberton had gone pale. His papers slipped from his fingers and scattered across the desk. "Your Grace, I don't understand." "You will," Alexander said simply. His eyes had not left Evelina. Shortly, Margaret had recovered enough to attempt indignation. "Your Grace, this is highly irregular. The will has been read, properly witnessed, and filed. Whatever claim you believe you have is ironclad," Alexander finished. He finally looked away from Evelina to address Margaret directly, and his expression could have frozen fire. "I have documents that supersede this will. Documents that establish Miss Whitford's rightful inheritance. Documents that I will be more than happy to have my solicitors present to yours, though I suspect Mr. Pemberton may already be aware of certain complications." The solicitor made a sound halfway between a cough and a whimper. "What documents?" Margaret demanded, her voice rising. "Edmund never mentioned. Lord Whitford wrote to me in July," Alexander said, 4 months before his death, the same month, I note, that he drafted this will. Interesting timing, wouldn't you say? Beatrice and Constance exchanged confused glances. Evelina remained frozen near the door, afraid that if she moved, this strange dream would shatter, and she would wake to find herself still sitting on that hard chair, still receiving nothing, still invisible. Alexander turned back to her. "Miss Whitford, I apologize for the dramatic nature of my arrival. I had hoped to reach Fairfield before the will was read, but the roads—" He gestured vaguely at his rain-dampened clothes. "I trust we can discuss the particulars of your inheritance in more comfortable circumstances. If you'll permit me." Evelina found her voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. "I don't understand." Something flickered in Alexander's ice-blue eyes, an expression too quick to name. "I know. I will explain everything. You have my word." "Your word means nothing if the law—" Margaret began. "The law," Alexander said, his voice dropping to a temperature that made the cold drawing room feel tropical by comparison, "is entirely on my side, Lady Margaret, as you will discover. Now, if you'll excuse us, Miss Whitford and I have much to discuss." He extended his hand toward Evelina. She stared at it strong, elegant, offered with such certainty, and felt the world tilt beneath her feet. This morning she had woken knowing she had nothing. This afternoon she had had that nothing confirmed. And now this stranger, this duke, stood in the drawing room offering her. What? His hand? An inheritance? Himself? "Miss Whitford inherits me, and I own everything." The words echoed in her mind, impossible and yet spoken with such absolute conviction that she found herself believing them despite their impossibility. Evelina had spent 23 years learning to be invisible, to take up no space, to expect nothing and receive less. She had mastered the art of survival through silence and stillness. But as she looked at Alexander Sinclair's outstretched hand, as she felt the weight of his ice-blue gaze that saw her, truly saw her, something long dormant stirred in her chest. She took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm despite the November chill, steady and sure. She felt calluses that spoke of a man who did more than sign documents and attend balls. His grip was firm but gentle, respectful of her autonomy, even as it offered support. "Good," Alexander said softly, and for the first time she heard something other than cold command in his voice. "Then, let us begin." Chapter 2. The arrangement explained. "The library," Alexander said, his hand still holding Evelina's. "We require privacy for this discussion." Lady Margaret's face had progressed through several shades of red before settling on an alarming purple. "Your Grace, I must protest." "You may protest all you wish, Lady Margaret. In the library." Alexander's tone brooked no argument. "Unless you'd prefer I explain the situation here, in front of Mr. Pemberton and your daughters, I'm certain they would find the details illuminating." Margaret's mouth snapped shut. Whatever she saw in Alexander's expression convinced her that discretion was the wiser course. She swept toward the library with the air of a woman heading to her own execution, Beatrice and Constance trailing uncertainly behind her. Evelina found herself guided by Alexander's steady hand, her mind still struggling to catch up with the past 10 minutes. The library at Fairfield Manor was not large. Her father had not been a great reader, but it was warmer than the drawing room, with a fire burning in the grate. The shelves held mostly books on estate management and hunting, interspersed with the occasional novel that Margaret had deemed appropriate for her daughters. Alexander released Evelina's hand only once they were all assembled. He positioned himself near the fire, his back to the warmth, his face cast in dramatic relief by the flames. It was a commanding position, and Evelina suspected he had chosen it deliberately. Mr. Pemberton hovered near the door, looking as though he wished to be anywhere else. In July of this year, Alexander began without preamble, I received a letter from Lord Whitford. In it, he explained a matter that had weighed on his conscience for many years. He withdrew a folded paper from his coat. This letter. Margaret reached for it, but Alexander held it out of her grasp. You'll have your opportunity to examine it, Lady Margaret. Patience. He read aloud, his voice steady. Your Grace, I write to you regarding a matter of honor that I have shamefully neglected. 24 years ago, your late father and I entered into an agreement, a marriage contract between our families. At the time, I had only one daughter, born of my first marriage. Your father had only one son. The contract was meant to unite our estates and families. Evelina's breath caught. 24 years ago, she had been born in April of 1845. This contract had been written when she was an infant. Alexander continued reading. I had every intention of honoring this agreement, but after my first wife's death and my subsequent remarriage, I allowed my new wife to convince me that the contract should be reinterpreted. I was weak. I am ashamed. But as I face my own mortality, I can no longer ignore the binding nature of the agreement I made with your father. I ask that you honor it, as I failed to do. My eldest daughter deserves better than what I have given her. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fire. That's impossible, Margaret said, her voice shaking. Edmund would never. He knew that contract was meant for a legitimate heir, not some... The contract, Alexander interrupted, producing a second document. This one, yellowed with age and bearing 2 wax seals, specifies quite clearly Lord Whitford's eldest daughter. It makes no mention of legitimacy. Miss Evelina Whitford, born April 1845, is precisely that. Your daughters, Lady Margaret, were born in 1847 and 1849. They are younger. He laid the contract on the desk between them. Evelina could see the spidery handwriting, the impressive seals, the signatures at the bottom, her father's name, and another, Thomas Sinclair, Duke of Blackwood. This is a legal document, Alexander continued, his voice cold as January frost, drawn up by solicitors, witnessed by parties of good standing, and filed with the appropriate authorities. It stipulates that upon the eldest Whitford daughter reaching her majority, or upon Lord Whitford's death, whichever came first, she would be entitled to a marriage settlement, including property, income, and the protection of the Sinclair family name. Mr. Pemberton made a strangled sound. I was not aware, that is, Lord Whitford never mentioned, because Lord Whitford allowed his second wife to convince him to ignore his obligations, Alexander said, a decision he apparently came to regret. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. She's illegitimate. No court would uphold a marriage contract for a bastard child. Actually, Mr. Pemberton said quietly, if I may, Lady Margaret, the law regarding marriage contracts is quite clear. If Lord Whitford acknowledged Miss Whitford as his daughter, which he did, publicly, by allowing her to bear his name and reside in his household, then her birth status is irrelevant to the contract's validity. But her education, Margaret grasped at straws. Her complete unsuitability for... Miss Whitford has been managing your household accounts for the past 5 years, Alexander said. Evelina's head snapped up. How did he know that? I'm told her mathematical abilities are exceptional. She reads Latin and French. She plays the pianoforte. What exactly do you consider her unsuitable for, Lady Margaret? Margaret's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Alexander turned to Evelina for the first time since entering the library. His ice-blue eyes softened fractionally. Miss Whitford, you have a choice in this matter. The contract is binding, but I am not a man who would force any woman into an arrangement against her will. He gestured around the cold library, the gesture somehow encompassing all of Fairfield Manor and the life Evelina had endured within its walls. You may remain here, if that is your wish, or you may honor your father's agreement and come with me to Blackwood Hall. I will expect nothing untoward. You will have your own quarters, your own staff, and time to become acquainted before any formal arrangements are made. The choice was an illusion, and they both knew it. Stay here, where Margaret would make her life unbearable now that she had no protection, or leave with a stranger who claimed a legal obligation to her. Terror of the unknown warred with certainty of misery. Evelina's eyes moved to Margaret's furious face, to Beatrice's studied disinterest, to Constance's barely concealed relief that she wasn't the one in this position. 23 years. 23 years of invisibility, of taking up no space, of managing accounts and mending linens and pretending she didn't exist. I'll need a quarter-hour to gather my belongings. Your Grace. Alexander's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but close. Take 30 minutes. I'll have my driver bring the carriage around. Evelina's room in the servants' quarters was small and cold, tucked under the eaves where the roof sloped sharply. She had lived here for 5 years, since her 14th birthday, when Margaret had decided she was too old to occupy a proper bedroom. She moved quickly, pulling her worn traveling bag from under the narrow bed. 3 dresses, all of them dated and mended multiple times. Her nightgown, 2 pairs of stockings. She wrapped her hairbrush and the small bar of soap she'd saved from last Christmas. Then the hidden things. She pried up the loose floorboard near the window and retrieved her mother's locket, the only thing she had of her. A simple gold oval with a faded miniature portrait inside. 2 books she'd purchased from a traveling peddler with coins saved over years. Her sketch pencils, wrapped carefully in cloth. A knock at the door made her start. Mrs. Doughty, the elderly cook who had been at Fairfield since before Evelina was born, stood in the doorway. Her lined face was wet with tears. I heard what happened, dear girl. She pressed a packet wrapped in brown paper into Evelina's hands. Your mother's recipes. She copied them out in her own hand before she died. I've kept them safe all these years. She'd want you to have them. Evelina's composure, carefully maintained through the entire afternoon, cracked. Mrs. Doughty. You go with His Grace, the old woman said fiercely. You go and don't look back. Your mother would be proud of you. So proud. The embrace was brief, but fierce. Then Evelina was alone again, clutching the packet of recipes and blinking back tears she couldn't afford to shed. Not yet, not until she was far away from this place. The carriage was elegant, bearing the Sinclair crest on its door, a falcon in flight. The interior was lined with burgundy velvet, and oil lamps cast a warm glow against the gathering November darkness. Alexander handed her in with the same careful courtesy he'd shown since his arrival, then took the seat across from her. The driver called to the horses, and with a lurch, they were moving. Evelina watched through the rain-streaked window as Fairfield Manor receded into the mist, the only home she'd ever known, the place of her every unhappy memory, disappearing behind her. The reality of what she'd done settled over her like a cold blanket. She had left. She was in a carriage with a man she'd met less than 2 hours ago, a man who claimed he owned everything and that she somehow inherited him. The absurdity of it made her feel light-headed. Your Grace, she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the rattle of wheels on the rutted road. Why now? If this contract existed, why wait until my father died? In the lamplight, Alexander's face was all sharp angles and shadows. He was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. Your father asked me to wait, he finally said. He hoped Lady Margaret might soften toward you. He believed that given time, she might come to see your value. A bitter laugh escaped Evelina before she could stop it. He was wrong. Yes, he admitted as much in his final letter. Alexander's jaw tightened. He was a weak man who made weak choices. But in the end, he tried to do right by you. And you? Evelina found courage she didn't know she possessed. You could have ignored his letter. Why didn't you? Another long pause. Something flickered across Alexander's face pane, quickly masked. I waited because I had my own complications to resolve. He looked away, out the window at the dark countryside. Matters of the heart that needed to be put to rest before I could honor my father's agreement. Evelina absorbed this. He had loved someone, perhaps still did. And here she was, an obligation he'd inherited along with his title. You're not obligated to marry me, Miss Whitford, Alexander said, his voice careful. The contract entitles you to a settlement, regardless of whether a marriage takes place. You'll have property, income, independence, but I am obligated to protect you while you're under my guardianship. That I will do. The carriage hit a rut, and Evelina braced herself against the wall. Protect her. Not love her, not even want her. Just protect her, because a piece of paper said he must. She should be grateful. She was grateful. And yet, some part of her, foolish, hopeful, wished for more. "I don't understand you, Your Grace," she said softly. "You seem to want nothing from me, and yet you've upended your life to honor a contract made before either of us was born." Alexander turned back to her, and in the lamplight, his ice-blue eyes held depths she couldn't fathom. "Perhaps I'm simply a man who keeps his word. Or perhaps you're a man who always gets what he wants," Evelina countered, surprising herself. This time, Alexander's smile was real, if fleeting. "Perhaps I'm both, Miss Whitford. We have a long journey ahead to Blackwood Hall. You'll have ample time to determine which." The carriage rolled on through the November night, carrying Evelina away from everything she'd known toward a future she couldn't begin to imagine. Chapter 3. Blackwood Hall and First Connections. Blackwood Hall emerged from the darkness like something from a dream. The carriage had been traveling for hours through increasingly wild countryside, the roads growing narrower as they climbed into Derbyshire. Evelina had dozed fitfully, exhaustion finally overtaking anxiety, and when she woke, the Duke was gently touching her shoulder. "We've arrived?" Miss Whitford, through the window, she saw it, a massive Jacobean manor sprawling across a hillside, its mullioned windows blazing with light against the November night. The architecture was all dramatic gables and ornate stonework, intimidating in its grandeur yet somehow welcoming, with every window lit as if in greeting. Evelina's breath caught. This was to be her home? The carriage rolled to a stop before an entrance flanked by torches. Immediately, footmen appeared, not the 2 or 3 Fairfield could muster, but half a dozen, all in matching livery. The door opened, steps were lowered, and Alexander descended first, before turning to offer his hand. Evelina accepted it, her legs unsteady after the long journey. The cold air bit at her cheeks, carrying the scent of wood smoke and pine. "Your Grace, welcome home." An older woman in a housekeeper's black dress and crisp white cap stood at the entrance. Her face was kind, with laugh lines around her eyes and a warmth that reminded Evelina painfully of Mrs. Doughty. "And this must be Mrs. Hartwell. May I present Miss Evelina Whitford?" Alexander said. "Miss Whitford, this is Mrs. Hartwell, who has managed Blackwood Hall since before I was born." Mrs. Hartwell's smile widened as she curtsied. "Welcome home, Lady Evelina." The title struck Evelina like a physical blow. I'm only Miss," His Grace sent word ahead. "Mrs." Hartwell said gently, her eyes twinkling with understanding. "You're to be treated as the future Duchess. Now, you look exhausted, my dear. Let's get you settled." Before Evelina could protest, Mrs. Hartwell had taken her arm with maternal efficiency and was guiding her into the house. Alexander followed at a discreet distance. The entrance hall was breathtaking. Vaulted ceilings, a grand staircase that split in 2 directions, portraits of stern-faced ancestors lining the walls. But there was warmth here, too, fires blazing in massive fireplaces, the scent of beeswax and lavender, the sound of distant voices suggesting a household that actually functioned rather than merely existed. "Your rooms are in the East Wing, Mrs." Hartwell explained, as they climbed the stairs. "His Grace thought you'd prefer the morning light. The suite hasn't been used since the late Duchess, bless her soul, but we've aired it thoroughly and refreshed everything." Evelina's mind reeled. A suite. She'd lived in a single room under the eaves for 5 years. Mrs. Hartwell opened a door, and Evelina stepped into a space larger than the entire servants' quarters at Fairfield. 3 rooms. A bedroom with a 4-poster bed draped in blue silk, a sitting room with elegant furniture arranged before a roaring fire, and through another door, a dressing room with wardrobes and a full-length mirror. "There's hot water for washing," Mrs. Hartwell indicated a porcelain basin and ewer painted with delicate flowers. "And I've had cook prepare a light supper. You must be famished." A tray sat on a small table, soup that steamed and smelled of herbs, fresh bread, cheese, sliced apples. Real food, not the kitchen scraps Evelina had grown accustomed to at Fairfield. "I'll leave you to rest," Mrs. Hartwell said. "Ring if you need anything at all." "Anything, my dear. That's what we're here for." She paused at the door. "His Grace is a good man. You're safe here." The door closed softly, and Evelina was alone. She stood in the center of the bedroom, turning slowly to take it all in. The fire crackling cheerfully, the bed piled with quilts and pillows, the windows curtained in heavy blue velvet. Her small bag, already brought up, looking pitifully out of place on a chair that probably cost more than everything she owned. The tears came suddenly, overwhelming. Evelina sank onto the bed, so soft, so impossibly soft, and wept for the life she'd left behind, for her mother, gone 20 years but still missed, for her father, who'd finally tried to do right by her but only in death, for the sheer overwhelming contrast between the cold room under the eaves and this beautiful suite where she was welcomed, wanted, safe. She cried until she had no tears left, then washed her face in the warm water and ate every bite of the supper, savoring each mouthful like the gift it was. Morning light woke her, streaming through windows she'd forgotten to curtain. Evelina sat up, disoriented, until memory returned. Blackwood Hall, the Duke, the contract, real. She explored her rooms in daylight, discovering details she'd missed the night before. The sitting room had a writing desk stocked with paper and ink. The dressing room held wardrobes, and when she opened them, she found dresses. Simple, well-made dresses in her size, in colors she actually liked. Soft blues and grays and one in deep green. How had he known her measurements? Had her father provided them in his letter? A maid appeared young, friendly, eager to help, and soon Evelina was dressed in a blue morning gown that fit better than anything she'd worn in years. Her hair was arranged simply but neatly. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Mrs. Hartwell collected her for breakfast, leading her to a small dining room far more intimate than the grand hall she'd glimpsed the night before. Alexander was already there, seated at the head of the table with correspondence spread before him and a newspaper folded beside his plate. He rose immediately when she entered. "Miss Whitford, I trust you slept well?" "Very well, Your Grace. Thank you." The formality felt strange after their frank conversation in the carriage. He gestured to a chair. "Please, help yourself to whatever you'd like." The sideboard held more food than Evelina had seen in months. Eggs, bacon, kippers, toast, preserves, fruit. Her hands shook slightly as she served herself small portions, old habits of scarcity dying hard. They ate in silence, broken only by the clink of silverware. Alexander returned to his correspondence, giving her privacy even as they shared space. Evelina ate slowly, savoring everything, making each bite last. She didn't notice Alexander watching her until she looked up and caught him staring. His expression was unreadable, but his jaw was tight. "Forgive me," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "You didn't, Your Grace. I was just—" She couldn't finish. He set down his fork with careful precision. When he spoke next, it was to the air rather than to her. "Mrs. Hartwell, please ensure Miss Whitford has access to food whenever she wishes. The kitchens are always available to her." Mrs. Hartwell, appearing from nowhere as good housekeepers do, nodded. "Of course, Your Grace." Evelina's cheeks burned. He'd noticed, he'd understood, and he'd responded with quiet kindness rather than pity. The first week passed in a strange blur of adjustment. Evelina discovered the library, a glorious room lined floor to ceiling with books, at least 4,000 volumes, and spent hours there. Alexander found her one afternoon, curled in a window seat with a volume of poetry. "You're welcome to read anything here," he said. "Complete access. Consider it yours." She began helping Mrs. Hartwell with the household accounts, unable to resist when she noticed a discrepancy in the butcher's bills. Her mathematical abilities impressed the staff, and word spread that the future Duchess was both clever and kind. Alexander observed from a distance. He noticed how she thanked servants by name, how she moved through rooms as if still trying to take up no space, how she sometimes startled when addressed directly, as if expecting censure. He found himself seeking reasons to be in rooms she occupied, the library when she was reading, the morning room when she sketched, always at a careful distance, never intrusive, just aware of her presence. It was day 10 when everything shifted. Evelina had discovered a walled garden behind the east wing, overgrown and wild, but beautiful even in late November. The bare bones of what had once been carefully cultivated beds showed through the weeds. Rose vines climbed the walls, leafless now but promising. She was sketching the archway, her pencil capturing the romance of abandonment, when a voice behind her said, "My mother's garden." Evelina turned to find Alexander standing a respectful distance away, his expression softer than she'd yet seen it. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to trespass." "You're not trespassing. You live here." He moved closer, studying her sketch. "You're talented, self-taught," she admitted, From a book I found in Fairfield's library. May I? He gestured to the stone bench beside her. She nodded, and he sat, maintaining proper distance but close enough that she could smell sandalwood and something uniquely him. My mother loved this garden, Alexander said, his voice distant with memory. She spent every spare moment here. After she died, 5 years ago, I couldn't. I let it go wild. What was she like? Warm, kind, everything my father was not. His jaw tightened. He was a cold man who valued duty above all else. On his deathbed, his command to me was, marry strategically. The Sinclair name must be maintained at all costs. Evelina absorbed this. But you haven't married. In all these years. I had my reasons. The mask slipped back into place. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Finally, Evelina dared to speak her truth. My mother died when I was 3. I barely remember her, but I kept one thing she made her recipes. Foolish, perhaps, to treasure something so simple. Alexander turned to her, and his eyes were unexpectedly gentle. Not foolish. We preserve what we can of those we've lost. The conversation opened like a door. Alexander asked about her life at Fairfield, and for the first time, Evelina spoke honestly. About the loneliness, the invisibility, the small, daily cruelties that had shaped her into someone who expected nothing and made herself small. She watched Alexander's hands clench into fists. His fury, controlled but palpable, surprised her. You deserved better, he said simply. She looked at him, truly looked, and saw past the cold exterior to the grief beneath. They were both orphans, in their way, both shaped by loss and duty and the expectations of others. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. He stood abruptly, as if the moment had become too much. I should inform you we'll be going to London after Christmas. There will be a ball at the start of the season, in March, where I'll introduce you to society. You have 4 months to prepare. Evelina's stomach dropped. Society. The ball. All those people who would look at her and see exactly what Margaret saw. Not enough. Alexander must have read her expression. If you wish to learn anything, music, dancing, watercolors, languages, I'll arrange tutors. Not because you're lacking, he added quickly, but because you were denied opportunities you should have had. The casual acknowledgement of injustice made Evelina's eyes fill with tears. Alexander's discomfort was immediate. He stepped back, clearly unused to handling emotion. I'll leave you to consider what you'd like to study. Good evening, Miss Whitford. He was gone before she could respond, leaving her alone in the abandoned garden with her sketch and the growing realization that she was beginning to trust him. And that terrified her more than anything. Chapter 4. The Piano Crisis. The music room at Blackwood Hall had clearly been designed by someone who loved sound. High ceilings amplified every note, and the walls were paneled in wood that resonated with warmth. At its center sat a grand piano, a magnificent broadwood that must have cost a fortune, though a fine layer of dust suggested it had gone unplayed for some time. Evelina stood in the doorway, her heart racing. She had requested a music tutor among her studies along with French conversation and watercolors, but now that Signor Benedetti had arrived, she felt like a fraud. What right did she have to lessons from an Italian master when her only training had been stolen moments at an old schoolroom piano? Signorina Whitford. The man was small and elegant, with silver hair and sharp dark eyes. Please, come, sit. Her hands trembled as she settled on the bench. The keys were ivory, yellowed with age but perfectly maintained. She played a simple C major scale, and even that basic exercise revealed the instrument's quality. The tone was rich and pure, filling the room like liquid gold. Benedetti's eyebrows rose. Again, please. Both hands. 2 octaves. She complied. Her fingers remembered the patterns, the muscle memory built over years of secret practice. The technical skill was apparent even in something so simple, the evenness of her touch, the control, the precision. Who taught you? Benedetti demanded. No one, signor. I taught myself. From an instruction manual I found. His eyes widened in disbelief. Impossible. Play something more complex. Evelina closed her eyes, reaching for a piece she'd memorized years ago from sheet music she'd discovered in Fairfield's rarely used library. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Her fingers found the opening notes, and the music poured out achingly beautiful, full of longing and sorrow and all the feelings she'd never been allowed to express in words. There were small technical errors, she knew, places where her self-teaching had failed her, where a proper instructor would have corrected her fingering or her phrasing. But the emotion was there, raw and honest, turning the music room into a confession booth. When the final notes faded, silence hung in the air like smoke. "Signorina," Benedetti's voice was rough with emotion, "you are remarkable. With proper training, you could have been a concert pianist. Could have been." The words settled over Evelina like a shroud. All those lost years, all that potential wasted because Lady Margaret had deemed music an accomplishment for real ladies only. "We begin immediately," Benedetti declared. "There is much work to do, but you have the gift. The rest is merely technique." Unknown to Evelina, Alexander had been standing in the hallway when she played the Chopin. He'd been passing by, intending to review some papers in his study, when the music had stopped him in his tracks. It was achingly beautiful, full of longing and loss and a yearning so profound it made his chest tight. He'd stood frozen, transfixed, as the melody wove through him like a living thing. When the music ended, he found himself pushing open the door before conscious thought intervened. Evelina startled at his entrance, half rising from the bench. "Your Grace, I didn't know. I apologize if I disturbed. Why did you stop playing?" The words came out more sharply than he intended. "I didn't know anyone was listening. I'm sorry. You didn't disturb me. Play something else." She hesitated, glancing at Benedetti, who nodded encouragement. Then she turned back to the piano and began again, this time something lighter. Mozart, perhaps, but still imbued with that same emotional honesty. Alexander watched her transform. The guarded woman who moved through Blackwood Hall like a ghost, always trying to take up no space, disappeared. In her place was someone lost in beauty, someone free and unafraid and utterly herself. When she finished, he had to clear his throat before speaking. "Did they forbid you to play at Fairfield?" "Not exactly." Evelina's hands rested on the keys, not quite touching. "But Lady Margaret said it was presumptuous for someone of my station to waste time on accomplishments meant for real ladies." The cold fury that swept through Alexander was becoming familiar. Every day he learned some new cruelty that woman had inflicted, some new way she'd tried to diminish Evelina's spirit. "She was wrong," he said, his voice hard, "about everything." That evening, Alexander was in his study when the express letter arrived. He recognized the seal immediately, his estate manager in Cornwall, and marked urgent. The news was grim. One of the tin mines had collapsed. 3 men dead, their families now destitute. Potential legal liability that could cost the estate thousands. Tensions running high among the workers, threatening wider unrest. He needed to leave immediately. Cornwall was a 4-day journey in good weather, longer in December. He'd be gone at least 2 weeks, possibly more. He found Evelina in the library, curled in her usual window seat with a book. She looked up when he entered, and her smile, small but genuine, did something strange to his heart. "Miss Whitford, I'm afraid I must leave Blackwood tomorrow. Estate business in Cornwall. A mine collapse." The fear that flashed across her face was quickly masked, but he'd learned to read her. "Of course, Your Grace. I'll be perfectly fine. You think I'm abandoning you?" "No, your business is obviously important. Lives are at stake." He moved closer, drawn by something he didn't quite understand. Closer than was proper, close enough to see the green flecks in her eyes. "Miss Whitford, Evelina, I am coming back. You're safe here. Mrs. Hartwell and the staff will care for you, and I've left instructions with my solicitor. If you need anything at all, send word." She looked up at him, and he saw the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide. Years of abandonment had taught her not to trust promises. "I've never broken my word," he said quietly. "I won't start now." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and Alexander had to physically restrain himself from offering comfort. He wasn't certain he knew how to give. The next morning, before dawn, Alexander left a note and a key outside Evelina's door. He couldn't bear to wake her, couldn't bear another goodbye, so he did this instead. "The books in my study are precious to me. I trust you with them. There's a journal on the 3rd shelf, my mother's. You might find it companionable. A.S." When Evelina found it later that morning, she held the key in her palm for a long moment. His private study, his mother's journal. This was trust, freely given, and it moved her more than any grand gesture could have. The 2 weeks passed in a strange rhythm. Evelina practiced piano for hours daily, her skills improving dramatically under Benedetti's exacting instruction. She explored Alexander's study, running her fingers over the spines of books he'd chosen himself, sitting in his chair, imagining him there, and she read the late Duchess's journal. January 10th, 1843. Thomas says I worry too much about Alexander, that the boy needs to toughen up, learn to be a proper duke. But he's only 7 years old, and I see how he flinches when his father speaks harshly, how he tries so hard to be what's expected. I wish I could tell him it's acceptable to feel, to want, to need, but Thomas would never allow it. Page after page revealed an intelligent, witty woman trapped in a lonely marriage, pouring her warmth into a son who was being systematically taught to suppress every soft emotion. Evelina found parallels to her own life, but also understanding of Alexander's controlled nature. He'd been trained from childhood to wall off his heart. That he showed her any kindness at all was remarkable. She began managing more household affairs, working alongside Mrs. Hartwell with the accounts and menus. The staff responded to her with genuine affection, and Blackwood Hall started to feel like something she'd never had before, home. But she also struggled with Alexander's absence. She missed his quiet presence across the breakfast table, the way he'd appear in whatever room she occupied, always at a careful distance but there nonetheless, his rare almost smiles when she said something that surprised him. The realization hit her one evening as she sat alone in the music room, playing for an audience of empty chairs. She was falling in love with him. The thought terrified her. What if he could never return such feelings? What if she was simply an obligation he'd chosen to honor? The letter arrived on day 12. Evelina recognized the seal, the Fairfield Manor solicitor. Her hands shook as she broke it open. Miss Whitford, I write on behalf of Lady Margaret Whitford to inform you that the purported marriage contract between yourself and His Grace the Duke of Blackwood has been challenged on grounds of your illegitimate birth. Lady Margaret demands your immediate return to Fairfield Manor. Failure to comply will result in legal action against His Grace for unlawful confinement and potential kidnapping charges. You are further informed that any settlement or property claims based on said contract will be vigorously contested in court. I remain, etc., Mr. Grimsby, solicitor. The paper slipped from Evelina's fingers. Legal action. Kidnapping. What if Alexander decided she was too much trouble? What if he realized the scandal would damage his name beyond repair? Mrs. Hartwell found her 20 minutes later, still standing frozen in the entrance hall where the letter had been delivered. My dear, what's wrong? Evelina handed her the letter wordlessly. The housekeeper read it, her expression darkening. Then, surprisingly, she chuckled. That woman never learns, does she? What if His Grace decides I'm not worth the trouble? Child, look at me. Mrs. Hartwell took Evelina's hands. His Grace isn't a man who backs down from challenges, and I've seen how he looks at you when you're not watching. Evelina's heart stuttered. How does he look at me? Like you're a puzzle he's trying to solve, and like maybe he wants to be solved in return. Alexander returned 3 days later. In the middle of a December snowstorm, he was covered in travel dust, exhausted from 4 days of hard riding, but his first words to the footman who took his coat were, "Where is Miss Whitford?" "The music room, Your Grace." He found her there, playing something melancholy that matched the grey light filtering through snow-covered windows. She stopped mid-phrase when she saw him, and relief flooded her face so completely it took his breath away. "You came back. I said I would." He moved closer, noting the shadows under her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. "What's happened?" Wordlessly, she handed him Margaret's letter. Alexander read it, his expression growing progressively colder. Then, surprisingly, he laughed a short, harsh sound devoid of humor. "She has no legal standing whatsoever. My solicitor will respond. You're not going anywhere." A pause, waited with things unsaid. Then, quietly, "Unless you want to leave?" Evelina's whispered response, "No, I don't want to leave." Something shifted in Alexander's expression, hope, perhaps, or fear, or some combination of both. He was still standing close, still in his travel clothes, completely improper. His hair was disheveled from the wind, and there was mud on his boots, and he'd come straight to her before even changing. "I should let you return to your practice," he said, though he didn't move. "I'm told you've been making remarkable progress." As he finally turned to go, Evelina spoke. "Your Grace, I read your mother's journal. Thank you for sharing her with me." Alexander stopped. For just a moment, vulnerability showed in his face. She would have liked you. After he left, Evelina returned to the piano, but her mind was elsewhere. The walls around her heart were crumbling, and she had no idea how to stop it, or if she even wanted to. Chapter 5. The London season begins. London in late February was a different world entirely. The Sinclair townhouse in Mayfair was elegant, all cream-coloured stone, and tall windows overlooking a square planted with bare winter trees, but it felt less like home than Blackwood Hall. The rooms were smaller, the ceilings lower, the air tinged with coal smoke, and the constant rumble of carriage wheels on cobblestones. Evelina noticed the change in Alexander almost immediately. In Derbyshire, he had been gradually softening, those careful walls lowering inch by inch. Here, surrounded by the rigid hierarchies and watchful eyes of London society, his ducal armour snapped back into place. He was colder, more formal, every movement calculated for public consumption. It frightened her more than she wanted to admit. "We'll begin making calls tomorrow," he informed her over breakfast their second morning in town. "Lady Pemberton first. She's influential and, more importantly, fair-minded. If we secure her approval, others will follow." Evelina's hands tightened on her teacup. "And if we don't, we will." It wasn't confidence, exactly. More like absolute certainty that failure was simply not an option. The modistes' establishment on Bond Street was a temple to feminine fashion. Madame Rousseau, tiny, French, terrifyingly chic, circled Evelina like a predator evaluating prey. "She has good bones," the woman declared in heavily accented English, "and the colouring unusual, but we work with it. Your Grace, you have vision for what you want?" Alexander, who had insisted on accompanying them despite the impropriety, gestured to a bolt of emerald silk. "That? For the ball gown?" Madame Rousseau's eyebrows rose. "Bold choice. It will make her eyes extraordinary, but such a colour demands confidence." "She has it," Alexander said simply. Evelina protested as the dressmaker began taking measurements. "Your Grace, this is too extravagant. The cost—" "You'll be presented as my intended Duchess," Alexander interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "You'll be dressed accordingly. Intended." The word hung in the air between them like smoke. They had not discussed actual marriage since that first night at Fairfield. The contract entitled her to a settlement regardless. She could take the money, the property, and walk away. Neither of them had acknowledged that truth aloud, but it shadowed every interaction. Madame Rousseau's sharp eyes missed nothing. Love match or arrangement? "Does it matter?" Alexander's voice was cold. "For the dress, no. For the woman wearing it, yes." The modiste smiled knowingly. "Don't worry, Your Grace. I make her beautiful either way." Lady Pemberton's drawing room was packed when they arrived the following Tuesday. Evelina recognized the tactical nature of the invitation. Immediately this was a test, designed to evaluate her under pressure. Lady Pemberton herself was 60, handsome rather than beautiful, with intelligent eyes and a reputation for progressive politics. She greeted Evelina warmly enough, but the other women in attendance were less welcoming. Lady Ashford, rail-thin and dripping diamonds. Mrs. Drummond-Burrell, whose power over Almack's vouchers could make or break a debutante. The Duchess of Lennox, young and beautiful, and watching Evelina with undisguised curiosity. "Miss Whitford," Lady Ashford began, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "And where are your people from?" "Hampshire," Lady Ashford. "How interesting. And your mother's family?" The trap was obvious. Evelina chose honesty over evasion. "My mother died when I was 3. I know little of her family." "I understand your father was Lord Whitford, of Hampshire." Lady Ashford's smile sharpened. "I don't recall a Whitford daughter being presented." The implication was clear as crystal. Illegitimacy, scandal, unsuitability. Evelina met the woman's eyes steadily. "My father valued privacy in his family matters, Lady Ashford, as do I." "Privacy." Lady Ashford's laugh was brittle. "How convenient." Alexander, who had been conversing with Lady Pemberton across the room, materialized at Evelina's side with the predatory grace of a wolf. "Miss Whitford has been managing Blackwood's household accounts for the past 3 months. Her mathematical abilities are remarkable. Perhaps you ladies might consult her on the new budgeting reforms Parliament is considering for estate management." He'd skillfully redirected the conversation from scandal to competence, and Lady Pemberton, bless her, seized the opportunity. "Indeed, I'd be most interested to hear your thoughts, Miss Whitford. These reforms could significantly impact how estates are managed. Do you follow the debates?" Evelina did. She'd been reading the Times religiously at Blackwood, and discussions of Irish land reform and tenant rights had fascinated her. She spoke carefully but with genuine knowledge, and watched Lady Pemberton's expression shift from polite interest to actual engagement. The tide shifted, subtly. Not complete acceptance, but a crack in the wall of dismissal. As they were leaving, Evelina overheard Lady Ashford's stage whisper to Mrs. Drummond-Burrell, "He must pity the poor girl." What else could it be? The words struck like a blade between her ribs. That evening, Evelina found Alexander in the library of the townhouse. He was reviewing correspondence, but looked up immediately when she entered. "Why are you doing this?" The question burst out before she could stop it. "Truly?" Alexander set down his pen with careful precision. "The contract obligates me to protect you, and you've proven yourself more than capable of being a duchess. But you don't love me." The words fell into silence like stones into water. Alexander's face went carefully blank. "I don't know if I'm capable of that anymore," he said finally. "But I respect you. I enjoy your company. Isn't that a better foundation than the passionate matches that burn out?" Evelina's heart clenched. He was offering her pragmatism, partnership, everything except the one thing she had begun to desperately want. And what if I wanted more than respect? Alexander looked at her with such intensity she almost stepped back. His ice-blue eyes held something raw and unguarded for just a moment before the mask slammed back into place. "Then you might be disappointed," he said, his voice rough. "I am not an easy man to love." "No," Evelina agreed quietly, "but perhaps I am not an easy woman to love either." The conversation ended there, both of them shaken, neither willing to push further toward truths they weren't ready to face. Lord James Hawthorne arrived the next afternoon while Alexander was out. He was everything. Alexander was not gregarious, charming, with laugh lines around his eyes and an easy manner that immediately put people at ease. "Miss Whitford, a pleasure to finally meet you properly." Alexander's spoken of little else these past months. Evelina doubted that very much, but appreciated the kindness. "Lord Hawthorne, would you like tea?" "Actually, I need to speak with Alexander. Is he in?" "He's gone to his club. Is something wrong?" Hawthorne hesitated, clearly debating how much to share. "Lady Margaret is in London." Evelina's stomach dropped. "I see. She's been active in society, spreading certain stories about you and his grace. Nothing Alexander's solicitors can't handle, but thought he should know." Another hesitation. "She's also been seen with Lady Caroline Blackwood, rather frequently." At the name Caroline, something cold slithered down Evelina's spine. Alexander's face had gone carefully blank when Hawthorne mentioned it, and Evelina noticed. After Hawthorne left, she confronted Alexander directly. "Who is Caroline?" "Someone from my past. It's not relevant. If Lady Margaret thinks it's relevant enough to parade her around London, perhaps I should know." Alexander's jaw tightened. He moved to pour himself brandy, then seemed to think better of it. 5 years ago, I was involved with Lady Caroline Blackwood. My father forbade the match. She was a baron's daughter, acceptable but not advantageous. I was prepared to defy him. He delivered the next part flatly, emotionlessly. Caroline chose to marry the Earl of Harwich instead, for his title and wealth. Evelina absorbed this. "Did you love her?" "I thought I did, but I was young and foolish. And now? If she's in London." Alexander met her eyes, and she saw old pain there, carefully locked away. "Now I am engaged in honoring a contract with you. Whatever I felt then is irrelevant." It wasn't the reassurance she wanted. It wasn't a declaration that he felt nothing for Caroline now, just that his duty to Evelina took precedence. She should be grateful for his honesty. Instead, she felt hollow. The night before the ball, Evelina couldn't sleep. Her mind raced with images of tomorrow, the scrutiny, the whispers, Margaret's poison spreading through society like disease, and Caroline, beautiful, titled Appropriate Caroline. She found herself drawn to the music room, settling at the pianoforte and playing softly, something melancholy that matched her mood. I heard the music. Couldn't sleep either. Alexander stood in the doorway, still dressed but rumpled, as if he'd been pacing his own rooms. "I'm sorry if I disturbed." "You didn't." He moved into the room, closing the door behind him with improper intimacy. "Tomorrow weighs on you. Tomorrow. Caroline. All of it." He sat beside her on the bench, closer than proper, but darkness made its own rules. "I'm not good at this. At feeling. My father trained it out of me. And Caroline, what happened with her made me believe it was better to feel nothing. And yet you feel anger on my behalf. You feel protective. You feel something. Yes, he admitted quietly, and she heard the fear beneath the word. And it terrifies me. The confession hung between them, fragile and honest. Tomorrow will be difficult, Alexander said. Society will judge you. Margaret will try to destroy you, but I will be beside you. That I can promise. I'm not afraid of society's judgment anymore, Evelina whispered. I'm only afraid of what? Of this not being real, of waking up and finding myself back at Fairfield. Alexander did something unprecedented. He took her hand, his fingers warm and solid around hers. This is real. Whatever else it is, or isn't, it's real. They sat there in the darkness, hands clasped, both terrified of tomorrow and of the feelings neither was quite ready to name. Outside, London slept. Inside, two damaged souls found something that might, someday, resemble hope. Chapter 6. The Ball and Margaret Strike. Evelina stood before the full-length mirror in her chambers and barely recognized the woman looking back. The emerald silk gown fit perfectly, its color transforming her eyes into jewels. Madame Rousseau had outdone herself. The bodice was elegant without being ostentatious. The skirt fell in graceful lines that suggested wealth without screaming it. Her hair had been dressed by a lady's maid Alexander had hired, swept up with subtle artistry that emphasized the slender column of her neck. But the transformation was internal as much as external. The invisible girl who had sat on a hard-backed chair at Fairfield Manor, expecting nothing and receiving less, was gone. In her place stood a woman who had survived, who had learned to value herself, who refused to be diminished. Mrs. Hartwell appeared in the doorway, and tears immediately filled her eyes. "Oh, my dear, you look like a duchess." Evelina turned from the mirror, feeling the silk whisper around her legs. "I feel like an imposter." "Then you're a magnificent one." The housekeeper squeezed her hands. "Hold your head high tonight. You've earned this." Evelina's resolve hardened. She would not let Margaret win. Not tonight. Not ever again. The ballroom of the Sinclair London residence had been transformed into something from a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers blazed with hundreds of candles, hothouse flowers impossible in March, but procured at enormous expense, filled every corner with the scent of roses and lilies. An orchestra occupied a raised platform, their instruments gleaming. 300 guests packed the space, all of London's elite crammed into one room to witness the Duke of Blackwood's mysterious intended. Evelina waited at the top of the grand staircase, her hand resting lightly on Alexander's arm. He looked devastating in formal black, every inch the powerful Duke. But when he looked down at her, something softened in his ice-blue eyes. "Ready?" he murmured. "No, but let's proceed anyway." His lips quirked in that almost smile she'd come to treasure. "That's my girl." They descended together, and Evelina felt the collective weight of 300 gazes. The conversations died away like a wave receding. She heard the intake of breath, saw the fans snap open, watched mouths form whispered words she was grateful she couldn't hear. But she kept her head high, her steps measured, her hand steady on Alexander's arm. Not because she felt confident, but because she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her falter. At the bottom of the stairs, Alexander led her to the receiving line. His voice carried across the suddenly silent ballroom. "Lady Evelina Whitford, my intended bride." The words were a declaration, a claim, a line drawn in the sand. The reactions were mixed. Some guests offered genuine warmth. Lady Pemberton's smile was encouraging, Lord Hawthorne's greeting charmingly enthusiastic. Others barely concealed their disdain, their curtsies perfunctory, their eyes assessing and finding her wanting. Evelina smiled and nodded and murmured appropriate responses, all while her heart hammered against her ribs. Then Margaret arrived. She swept in like a ship in full sail, Beatrice and Constance trailing in her wake like reluctant dinghies. Her gown was purple silk pushing the boundaries of half-mourning for Lord Whitford, and diamonds glittered at her throat and wrists. Her smile was venomous as she approached. "Your Grace," she curtsied to Alexander with exaggerated deference. What a quaint gathering. Then she turned to Evelina, and her eyes were cold as January frost. "How unexpected to see you here, my dear. Playing dress-up, are we?" Every instinct screamed at Evelina to shrink, to apologize, to disappear. 23 years of conditioning was hard to overcome, but she thought of Alexander's hand on hers in the darkness, of Mrs. Hartwell's tears, of the woman in the mirror who refused to be invisible. "Good evening, Lady Margaret," she said, her voice calm and measured, How kind of you to attend. The social cut was subtle but unmistakable. Evelina turned away to greet the next guest, dismissing Margaret as if she were of no consequence whatsoever. Margaret's face flushed purple to match her gown. When Alexander led Evelina onto the dance floor for the first waltz, the rest of the room faded away. His hand was warm at her waist, properly positioned but somehow intimate. They moved together with surprising ease. All those lessons with the dancing master had paid off, and Evelina found herself relaxing into the rhythm. "You're doing beautifully," Alexander murmured. "I'm terrified." "I know. So am I." She looked up at him, surprised. "You? Afraid?" His expression was unguarded for once, vulnerable in a way she'd rarely seen. "Of what I'm feeling, of what it means." The music swelled around them, Strauss or something equally romantic, and they danced in charged silence. Evelina felt it then, the shift between them, the acknowledgement of something neither was quite ready to name. He cared for her, perhaps not love, not yet, but something real and growing. When the dance ended, polite applause rippled through the ballroom. Alexander kept her hand in his a moment longer than necessary, and Evelina felt hope bloom, dangerous and bright in her chest. The evening progressed in a blur of introductions and conversations. Several young ladies cut Evelina directly, turning their backs with deliberate rudeness, but others, impressed by Alexander's obvious devotion, engaged her in genuine conversation. She discussed the recent Irish land reforms with a member of Parliament's wife, debated the merits of Chopin versus Liszt with a music patron, held her own in discussions of estate management and household economics. She was holding her own, and it felt like victory. Then came the supper interval. Margaret had been drinking champagne steadily throughout the evening, the colour high in her cheeks, her movements increasingly unsteady. Evelina had been watching her warily, sensing the storm building. It broke during the pause between dancing and supper. Margaret's voice, pitched to carry across the suddenly quiet room. "Your Grace, I must commend you on your charitable nature. Taking in my late husband's byblow and elevating her so far above her station, though I wonder if you've considered the scandal when the truth of her origins becomes widely known." The room went deathly silent. Every eye turned to Evelina. This was the moment she dreaded: public humiliation, her illegitimacy thrown in her face before all of London society. But something had changed in Evelina over these past months. She was no longer that frightened girl on the hard-backed chair. She stepped forward, and her voice rang clear and steady. "Lady Margaret, I have never hidden my birth. Yes, I am Lord Whitford's daughter, born before his marriage to you. But my father acknowledged me, provided for me, and made arrangements for my future. If there is shame in my existence, it is not mine to carry." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I have spent my life being told I am less than others because of circumstances beyond my control. But the Duke of Blackwood sees me for who I am, not the circumstances of my birth. I am grateful for his regard, and I will endeavour to be worthy of it." Stunned silence greeted her words. Then, unexpectedly, Lady Pemberton began to applaud. Others joined in tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm. Not everyone, not even most, but enough to shift the tide. Margaret's face turned an alarming shade of purple. Alexander stepped forward and took Evelina's hand. His voice rang across the ballroom with ducal authority. "Lady Margaret, your presence here is no longer welcome. I must ask you to leave." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A duke publicly ejecting a guest was scandalous, unprecedented. "You cannot," Margaret sputtered. "I can and I am. You have maligned the woman I intend to marry. You have attempted to destroy her reputation out of spite. I will not tolerate it under my roof." He turned to address the assembled guests, his hand still holding Evelina's. "Miss Whitford is the most remarkable woman I have ever known. She has more intelligence, more grace, and more genuine nobility than half the people in this room who inherited their titles. I am honored that she has agreed to become my wife." It wasn't quite a declaration of love, but it was the closest Alexander had come. Evelina's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude. Margaret stood frozen, fury and humiliation warring on her face. Then she turned and stormed toward the exit, Beatrice and Constance trailing behind her. At the doorway, Constance glanced back at Evelina with something that might have been apology. Then they were gone. The ball continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Evelina found herself surrounded by well-wishers, some genuine, many opportunistic, all eager to be seen supporting the Duke's choice now that he'd made his position clear. She smiled and nodded and thanked them, exhaustion creeping in at the edges but exhilaration keeping her upright. Late in the evening, she and Alexander escaped to the terrace. The March air was cold, but Evelina welcomed it after the stifling heat of the ballroom. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for defending me. I meant every word." Alexander's expression was serious. "Evelina, I need to tell you something." "Alexander, a word." Lord Hawthorne appeared in the doorway, his expression urgent. "It's urgent." Alexander's jaw tightened with frustration, but he nodded. "I'll only be a moment." He squeezed Evelina's hand and disappeared back into the ballroom. Evelina stood alone on the terrace, watching the London night and feeling the unreality of everything that had just happened. Through the windows, she could see guests still dancing, still drinking champagne, the evening continuing as if nothing momentous had occurred. Then she saw her, a beautiful woman in sapphire blue, blonde hair dressed in elaborate curls, speaking with Alexander near the orchestra. Even from a distance, Evelina could see the familiarity between them, the way the woman touched Alexander's arm, the way he leaned in to hear her over the music. Lord Hawthorne gestured toward the terrace, toward Evelina. The blonde woman turned and looked directly at her. Even across the crowded ballroom, Evelina felt the assessment, the measuring. This woman was everything Evelina was. Not classically beautiful, perfectly polished, utterly appropriate. And Evelina knew, with sinking certainty, exactly who she was. Caroline. Chapter 7. The Caroline Shadow. Evelina woke to grey London light filtering through the curtains of her chamber. For a moment, she felt the lingering warmth of triumph. Alexander's public declaration, Margaret's defeat, the applause that had followed her words. Then she remembered the woman in sapphire blue, and the warmth died. At breakfast, Alexander was already seated. Correspondence spread before him like a barricade. He looked up when she entered, and something flickered in his ice-blue eyes before the mask settled back into place. "Good morning. I trust you slept well." The formality felt like a step backward after the intimacy of the ball. Evelina took her seat, her hands unsteady as she reached for the teapot. "Well enough, thank you." She wanted to ask about Caroline, wanted to demand who that woman was, why they'd looked so familiar with each other, what they'd discussed, but the words stuck in her throat, trapped by years of learning not to ask for things she had no right to. "I have business meetings all day," Alexander said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Estate matters, parliamentary discussions. I likely won't return until evening." "Of course," Evelina forced a smile. "I'll be perfectly fine." He left shortly after, and Evelina was alone with her spiraling thoughts. Lord Hawthorne arrived mid-morning to check on them, his usual cheerfulness slightly muted. Evelina, desperate for information and unable to bear the uncertainty, did something unprecedented. "Lord Hawthorne, who is Lady Caroline Harwich?" He froze, teacup halfway to his lips. "Alexander hasn't told you?" He mentioned her briefly. Someone from his past. But last night, she was here, and they seemed... She couldn't finish. Hawthorne set down his cup with careful precision. "I don't wish to betray Alexander's confidence. Please, I need to understand." He studied her for a long moment, then sighed. Caroline was Alexander's. Well, they were very close 5 years ago. His father forbade the match. She was a baron's daughter, acceptable but not advantageous enough for a duke. Alexander was prepared to defy him. Evelina's heart sank. But she married someone else, the Earl of Harwich, for his wealth and title. Hawthorne's expression was carefully neutral. Her husband died 6 months ago, no children. She returned to London this season, a very wealthy widow. The implication was clear. Caroline was free now, free, wealthy, and socially appropriate. "She's expressed regret about her choice," Hawthorne added quietly. 5 years ago. Evelina felt cold despite the fire blazing in the grate. "She wants him back. What she wants and what Alexander wants are different things." Hawthorne leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Alexander is not the same man he was 5 years ago. You've changed him, Miss Whitford. I've known him since Cambridge, and I've never seen him as alive as he's been these past months." But Evelina's old insecurities were surfacing, all those years of being told she wasn't enough flooding back. Or perhaps I've merely been a distraction, something to occupy him until what he truly wanted became available again. "I don't believe that," Hawthorne said firmly, "and neither should you." But belief required courage Evelina wasn't certain she possessed. The next afternoon, seeking distraction, Evelina ventured to Hatchard's bookshop on Piccadilly. The familiar scent of leather and paper usually soothed her, but today her mind was too restless to settle. She was browsing the poetry section when she heard a voice cultured, musical, achingly familiar from the ball. "The new Tennyson is disappointing, I'm afraid. All that Arthurian nonsense. Give me the earlier work any day." Evelina froze. Through a gap in the shelves, she could see Caroline with an older woman, likely a companion. Up close in daylight, Caroline was even more beautiful than she'd appeared in the ballroom, golden hair, dressed in perfect ringlets. Porcelain skin, without a single flaw. Features that could have been sculpted by a master. Everything Evelina was not. She should leave, should flee before Caroline noticed her. But something pride, perhaps, or stubborn courage, kept her rooted in place. "Miss Whitford, isn't it?" Caroline had seen her, was moving toward her with a graceful glide that made Evelina acutely conscious of her own ordinary gait. "We weren't properly introduced last night," Caroline continued, her smile warm but her eyes assessing. "How rude of me. I'm Caroline Howich." "Lady Howich." Evelina managed a curtsy. Caroline dismissed her companion with a subtle gesture. "I'd like a word with Miss Whitford in private, if you don't mind." The older woman withdrew, and Evelina found herself trapped by social convention in a quiet corner of the bookshop. "You must think me terrible," Caroline began, her tone conversational. "Perhaps I am. I made a choice 5 years ago, security over love. I thought I was being practical. I was just being a coward." Evelina said nothing, waiting for the blade she knew was coming. "I've regretted it every day since," Caroline continued. "My marriage was empty. And now that I'm free, I return to find Alexander has moved on." She tilted her head, studying Evelina like a curiosity in a museum. "I won't pretend to understand what he sees in you. No offense intended, but you're not. Well, you're not what anyone expected." The subtle cruelty beneath the polite words was masterful. Evelina felt it like a physical blow, but refused to show it. "No," she agreed quietly. "I'm not. But perhaps that's precisely the point. I don't want Alexander for his title or his wealth. I care for the man beneath all that." Caroline's laugh was like crystal breaking. "How romantic. But you must realize he loved me. Deeply. That kind of first love doesn't just disappear." She leaned closer, her perfume expensive and cloying. "I'm not trying to hurt you, Miss Whitford. I'm trying to save you from humiliation. When Alexander realizes he can have what he truly wanted all along, where will that leave you?" Evelina's devastation was complete, but she maintained her composure. "If you'll excuse me, Lady Howich." She turned to leave, but Caroline's voice followed her. "He hasn't told you he loves you, has he?" The arrow hit its mark with devastating precision. Evelina fled. Back at the townhouse, Evelina's composure shattered. She stood in her chamber, Caroline's words echoing endlessly. "He hasn't told you he loves you." He hadn't. In all these months, through all their conversations and shared moments, Alexander had offered her protection, respect, partnership, but never love. What if he was only with her because of the contract? What if, given the choice given Caroline, beautiful and appropriate, and the woman he'd once loved, he would choose differently? Evelina pulled her traveling bag from the wardrobe and began to pack. Her hands shook, but she forced herself to continue. Better to leave now, with some dignity and tact, than to wait and be cast aside. "What are you doing, child?" Mrs. Hartwell stood in the doorway, her expression alarmed. "I can't compete with her," Evelina whispered, tears streaming down her face. "With what they had, with first love and beauty and everything, I'm not." "You're not competing," Mrs. Hartwell said firmly, crossing the room to take Evelina's hands. "You're offering something entirely different." But Evelina couldn't hear it. The old wounds had reopened, and she was drowning in the certainty of her own inadequacy. Alexander found the half-packed trunk when he returned that evening. His face went deathly pale. "What is this?" Evelina forced herself to meet his eyes. "I think perhaps we should reconsider this arrangement." "Why? What's happened?" "I met Caroline today," at his sharp intake of breath. "She loves you still, or so she says." Alexander's jaw tightened. "What she feels is irrelevant." "Is it? Can you honestly tell me you feel nothing for her?" The pause was too long. "I loved her once, 5 years ago, but that man doesn't exist anymore. And what about the man you are now? What does he feel? Why are you doing this?" Alexander's frustration was palpable. Evelina's voice broke. "Because you've never said you love me. You've offered me protection, respect, partnership, but not love, and I've realized that She couldn't continue. You what? Alexander demanded. I've fallen in love with you, she whispered, and I can't bear to be second choice to a ghost. Alexander stood frozen, clearly unprepared for this confession. His walls snapped into place, his face going carefully blank. Love is not. I cannot. Cannot what? Feel it? Or admit it? Evelina, I have spent 5 years teaching myself not to be vulnerable, not to want things I cannot have, not to feel, and yet you feel anger, you feel protectiveness, you felt wounded by Caroline's betrayal. You feel, Alexander, you just won't let yourself love. His raw honesty, when it came, was devastating, because everyone I've ever loved has either died or left me. My mother, my father, in his way. Caroline, I will not give that power to anyone again. Then I cannot marry you, Evelina said, her heart breaking, because I won't spend my life loving someone who refuses to love me back. That's not fair. Life isn't fair. I learned that at 3 years old. I need time, Alexander said finally. To think. Take all the time you need. I'll be here until you decide. He left, and Evelina collapsed onto the bed, sobbing. The letter arrived near midnight, slipped under her door by a servant. Evelina recognized the expensive stationery, the elegant handwriting. Miss Whitford, I thought you should know Alexander came to see me this evening. We talked for 2 hours. Whatever he decides, I hope you understand. Some bonds cannot be broken. C. H. Evelina's world shattered completely. She made her decision. In the morning, she would leave. Chapter 8. Confrontations and Revelations. Dawn broke grey and cold over London. Evelina had not slept. She finished packing by candlelight, her movements mechanical, her mind numb. Everything she owned fit into one small trunk and a travelling bag. 23 years of existence, reduced to this. She left the note on her writing desk, the words blurring through her tears as she wrote them. Your Grace, I release you from all obligations. The contract can be dissolved. Thank you for your kindness these past months. I will never forget it. E. W. Simple, dignified, final. She found a footman in the hallway and requested transport. Where to, miss? He asked. The question stopped her. Where indeed? She had no money of her own, no friends in London, no references for employment. The bitter irony settled over her like a shroud. She had to return to Fairfield, back to Margaret. She was loading her trunk when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, hurried. Then Alexander appeared at the end of the hallway, and her breath caught. He looked terrible. His hair was dishevelled, his cravat missing, his waistcoat unbuttoned. He clearly hadn't slept either. You're leaving? It wasn't a question. Evelina forced herself to meet his eyes. Yes, because of what Caroline told you, that I visited her. Did you? A pause that lasted an eternity. Yes. The confirmation broke something in Evelina's chest, but she maintained her composure. Then there's nothing more to discuss. There's everything to discuss. Evelina, let me explain. I don't want explanations. I want... She couldn't finish. What did she want? Love, freely given. A man who chose her without reservation. Things she had no right to demand. She tried to move past him, but Alexander blocked her path. It matters to me, he said. What you want, does it? Truly? Or am I just another obligation? Alexander's frustration finally boiled over. You are the most infuriating, stubborn, remarkable woman I have ever met, and I... He stopped abruptly, the words dying on his lips. You what? Evelina demanded, echoing their conversation from days ago. But his walls were still up, his defenses intact. I need you to stay, to give me time. Time for what? To decide between me and Caroline? To work out which is the more advantageous match? That's not... I won't be chosen, Alexander. Evelina's voice was steady despite her breaking heart. I choose myself. For the first time in my life, I choose myself. She pushed past him and left. The journey to Hampshire was long and lonely. Evelina hired a public coach, spending precious coins she'd saved from household management. The other passengers, a merchant's wife, 2 clerks. An elderly clergyman ignored her, absorbed in their own concerns. She arrived at Fairfield Manor as dusk was falling, the familiar grey stone looking grimmer than ever in the fading light. Margaret answered the door herself, clearly having dismissed most of the staff. Her shock at seeing Evelina was almost comical. "What are you doing here?" Evelina lifted her chin. "The engagement is ended. I need temporary lodging until I can make other arrangements." Margaret's expression shifted to cruel delight. I knew he'd come to his senses. Once a bastard, always a bastard. The old Evelina would have crumbled. The new one simply asked, "May I stay or not?" Margaret's calculation was visible. Having Evelina here, defeated, was too delicious to refuse. The servants' quarters, fine. In London, Alexander stood in his study surrounded by reminders of Evelina. The household accounts in her precise handwriting, a book she'd left on his desk, a ribbon marking her place, her sketch of the rose garden, which he'd found and kept without telling her. "Where's Miss Whitford?" Lord Hawthorne stood in the doorway, his usual cheer notably absent. "She left. And you let her go?" Alexander's composure cracked. "I don't know how to do this, James. I don't know how to be what she needs. Did she ask you to be anything other than honest?" "She asked me to love her. And do you?" Silence stretched between them. Then, quietly, "I'm terrified that I do." Hawthorne crossed the room and poured them both brandy. "Then why did you let her leave?" "Because I did go to Caroline last night. Evelina was right about that." Hawthorne's hand stilled on the decanter. "And Caroline said she wanted me back, that she'd made a mistake, that we could start again." "What did you say?" Alexander took the brandy but didn't drink. "I told her she was 5 years too late, that whatever I felt for her had died the day she married Harwich, that I couldn't even remember why I'd loved her in the first place. Because all I could think about was Evelina." The words poured out now, unstoppable. Her courage, her kindness, the way she transforms when she plays piano, how she makes me want to be better than I am. "You're an idiot," Hawthorne said flatly. "I'm aware. Go after her. She won't want to see me. Then make her listen." Alexander arrived at Fairfield Manor that evening, travel-worn and desperate. He pounded on the door with enough force to wake the dead. Margaret answered, her face draining of colour when she saw him. "Your Grace, I didn't. She doesn't wish to see you." "Let her tell me that herself." Margaret's desperation was palpable. She was losing control again, and she knew it. But she had one final card to play. "You think you're so noble, rescuing her, but she was never yours to rescue. That marriage contract you found? It's fraudulent." Alexander went very still. "Explain." "My husband's solicitor and I created it. After Whitford contacted you last summer, he was dying, guilty, wanted to provide for his bastard. We knew you'd honor an old family contract, so we made one." The truth settled over Alexander like ice water. There had never been an original agreement between the fathers. "Why are you telling me this now?" Margaret's smile was venomous. "Because you have no legal obligation to her. You're free. Take your Caroline and leave Evelina to her proper place." "And what," came a voice from the shadows, "is my proper place, Lady Margaret?" Evelina stood in the doorway to the servants' hall. She'd heard everything. Alexander saw devastation flash across her face before she mastered it. But instead of breaking, Evelina stood taller. 23 years, she said, her voice ringing with quiet power. 23 years you've tried to make me believe I'm worthless, that I don't deserve love, respect, or even basic dignity. Because it's true." "No," Evelina cut her off. "It was never true. I survived you. I survived neglect and cruelty and constant diminishment. And I discovered something. My worth doesn't come from a contract, or a father's acknowledgement, or even a duke's protection." She looked directly at Margaret. "It comes from me, from who I am, from what I've endured and overcome." Then she turned to Alexander. "You owe me nothing. The contract is void, as she says. You're free to choose Caroline or anyone else, Evelina. But I'm free too. Free from you," she looked back at Margaret, "and your poison. I'm leaving Fairfield, and I will never return." Margaret's fury exploded. "Leave? And go where? You have nothing." "I have myself." Evelina's smile was small but genuine. "That's more than you ever gave me, and it's enough." She turned toward the door. "Evelina, wait, please." She paused, but didn't turn. Alexander's voice was raw, stripped of all ducal composure. "The contract may be fraudulent, but what I feel isn't. I went to Caroline last night to end whatever ghost still lingered. I told her I couldn't love her because I was in love with someone else." Evelina turned slowly. "I'm in love with you," Alexander said. "I have been for months, I think, but I was too afraid and too stupid to see it. You said I won't let myself love you were right, but I'm trying. I'm here. I'm telling you." Tears streamed down Evelina's face. "How can I believe you? Because I'm standing here, terrified, telling you the truth. Because I'm asking no, begging you to give me another chance. And if I can't, if I'm too hurt, then I'll wait. I'll prove it. Every day for the rest of my life if necessary." Margaret's screech cut through the moment. "This is absurd. She's nothing. No one." Alexander never took his eyes off Evelina. "She's everything." Evelina stood between her past and her future. Trust versus self-protection. The familiar pain of disappointment versus the terrifying possibility of hope. But she'd learned something these past months. She was brave. She was worthy. She could risk. "I love you," she told Alexander, "but I won't be a replacement for anyone. You're not. You never were. And I need you to work on letting me in, on not running when things are difficult." "I will. I promise." She took a step toward him, then another, then yes. "I'll give us another chance." Alexander closed the distance and took her hands in his. "Thank you." He kissed her then, tender and full of promise and relief. Their first kiss, witnessed by a furious Margaret whose protests faded into blessed irrelevance. When they finally pulled apart, Evelina was smiling through her tears. "Take me home?" "Always," Alexander said. "Always." Chapter 9. True Inheritance. Evelina woke to sunlight streaming through the windows of her chambers at Blackwood Hall, the light golden and warm, with the promise of late April. She lay still for a moment, savoring the quiet, before memory returned. Today was her wedding day. She rose and moved to the window. Below, the rose garden sprawled in full bloom, pink and white and crimson blossoms covering every vine and bush. Alexander had begun its restoration the day after their reunion at Fairfield, hiring a small army of gardeners to reclaim what had been lost. It was his wedding gift to her, he'd said, a symbol of things once dead now blooming again. A knock at the door, and Mrs. Hartwell entered bearing a breakfast tray and wiping away happy tears. "Your wedding day, my dear girl." Evelina embraced the housekeeper, this woman who had shown her kindness when she'd expected none. "Thank you for everything." As she ate, Evelina reflected on the journey that had brought her here. 5 months ago, she'd been the invisible girl on the hard-backed chair, inheriting nothing, expecting nothing, worth nothing in the eyes of those who should have loved her. Now she sat in a duchess's chambers, about to marry a man who had taught her that love was not obligation but choice. The transformation still felt like a dream. The wedding would be small and intimate by their choice. 50 guests, no more. People who genuinely cared for them rather than the 300 society demanded. Her gown hung ready, simple ivory silk, elegant in its restraint, but the lace at the sleeves and neckline was special, taken from Alexander's mother's wedding dress, a gift that had made Evelina weep when he'd presented it. "She would have wanted you to have it," he'd said simply. Another knock. Evelina called permission to enter, expecting her lady's maid, but instead Beatrice and Constance appeared in the doorway, both looking hesitant. "May we come in?" Beatrice asked. Evelina hadn't seen her half-sisters since that terrible night at Fairfield. Surprise rendered her momentarily speechless. Then, of course, they entered, both dressed simply but elegantly. Constance spoke first, the words tumbling out as if rehearsed. "We wanted to apologize. For years of silence. We should have defended you against Mother." "We were cowards," Beatrice added quietly. "You were brave." Evelina felt old anger stir, then fade. They had been children, as she had been, shaped by the same woman who had tried to break her. "You were children, as was I. I forgive you." The relief on their faces was palpable. Constance stepped forward. "Mother has left England, gone to live with her sister in Edinburgh. She couldn't bear the scandal after. Everything." Evelina felt only relief, no triumph. Margaret's exile was her own doing, her own choice. "I hope she finds peace." "You're generous," Beatrice said, "more generous than she deserves." A moment of fragile connection passed between the three sisters. It would never be deep affection. Too much history stood between them, but perhaps, in time, something like friendship might grow. "Thank you for coming," Evelina said. "It means more than you know." The Blackwood Chapel was small and ancient, its stone walls dating back to the 13th century. 50 guests filled the wooden pews, Lord Hawthorne as Alexander's best man, Lady Pemberton surprisingly present as Evelina's supporter, household staff who had become friends, a few carefully chosen members of society who had proven themselves genuine. As Evelina walked down the aisle on Mrs. Hartwell's arm, the housekeeper, standing in as the mother she'd never had. She saw Alexander waiting at the altar. His expression stole her breath. Awe and love and lingering disbelief at his good fortune, all written plainly on his face for anyone to see. The cold duke was gone entirely, replaced by a man whose heart showed in his eyes. The vows were traditional, the same words spoken by countless couples before them, but when Alexander said "I do," his voice cracked with emotion, and when Evelina echoed the words, she meant them with every fiber of her being. Their kiss was tender and sweet, witnessed by people who genuinely wished them well. No calculation, no scheming, just pure joy. The wedding breakfast was held in Blackwood's great hall, the long table laden with spring flowers and fine food. Laughter echoed off the ancient stones as toasts were made. Lord Hawthorne stood, glass raised. "I've known Alexander since our days at Cambridge. I've seen him in many circumstances, usually dour ones, but I've never seen him happy, until Evelina." Lady Pemberton followed, her voice carrying authority. "To the Duchess of Blackwood, may she inspire us all to value character over circumstance. She has certainly inspired me." Then, at Alexander's request, Evelina played the piano. She'd composed a piece herself over the past weeks, pouring into the music everything she felt. Sorrow transformed to joy, loneliness becoming connection, winter yielding to spring. When the final notes faded, there wasn't a dry eye in the hall. After the breakfast, Alexander took Evelina's hand and led her to his study. "I have something for you, a wedding gift." He handed her a sheaf of legal documents. Evelina recognized the seal of his solicitor and began to read. Fairfield Manor had been purchased by the Sinclair estate. "Why would you?" she began, confused. "Keep reading," Alexander urged gently. The next document outlined the transformation. Fairfield was to be converted into a home and school for young women in difficult circumstances. Girls like Evelina, illegitimate, orphaned, displaced, denied opportunities through no fault of their own. They would be educated, trained in useful skills, given the tools to build independent lives. The home would be called the Whitford Foundation. Evelina's tears came fast and unstoppable. "You're transforming my prison into someone else's salvation." "Our salvation," Alexander corrected, taking her hands. "I want to run it together. Your vision, your compassion, your understanding of what these girls need, they should benefit from all of it." "This is more than I ever dreamed," Evelina whispered. Alexander smiled. "You dreamed too small. From now on, we dream together." Late afternoon found them in the rose garden, seated on a stone bench, surrounded by blooming flowers. The guests had departed, the household settled into evening, quiet, and they were finally, blissfully alone. "Do you remember what you said that first day?" Evelina asked. "She inherits me, and I own everything." Alexander's lips quirked. "I was trying to sound commanding. Did it work?" "It terrified me, but now I understand what you meant." "Do you?" "You were saying I wasn't inheriting things, money, property, titles. I was inheriting a partnership, a life." Alexander took her hand, threading their fingers together. "And I inherited you, your strength, your grace, your capacity for forgiveness. You brought me back to life." "We inherited each other," Evelina said softly. "Yes, and that's worth more than any estate or fortune." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. "I want children," Alexander said eventually. "Eventually." "If you do," Evelina smiled. "Eventually. But let's enjoy this first, just us." "Agreed." He paused. "I need to tell you something. About the contract." "What about it?" "I knew it was fraudulent within a week of receiving it." Evelina turned to stare at him. "What?" "My father's papers were meticulous. There was no record of any agreement. I had my solicitor investigate immediately. He confirmed the forgery." "Then why?" "Because your father's letter was genuine. His love for you, his regret, his desperation to protect you, that was all real. The contract might have been fake, but his intent was true. And when I saw you that day at Fairfield, so dignified in your pain, I knew I wanted to honor what he couldn't do in life." Evelina absorbed this revelation. "So you never owed me anything?" "No. Everything I did by choice. Even falling in love with me?" "Especially that." His smile was tender, though I fought it terribly. "And now I surrender gladly." As twilight deepened, they returned to the house. At the threshold, Alexander lifted Evelina in his arms. "What are you doing?" she laughed. "Carrying my Duchess across the threshold. Tradition." I thought you hated tradition. I'm learning to appreciate certain ones." He carried her inside, into warmth and light. In the great hall, the household staff had assembled, all wearing broad smiles. "Welcome home, Your Grace," Mrs. Hartwell said, her voice thick with emotion. And for the first time, Evelina truly felt it. This was home. Not because of the grand rooms or the ancient title, but because she was loved, valued, and free to be completely herself. Alexander set her down gently, keeping his arm around her waist. "Happy?" he asked quietly. She looked up at him, at the life they'd built from nothing, at the future stretching before them bright with possibility. "More than I ever thought possible." "Good, because I intend to spend the rest of my life making you happier still." Together, hand in hand, they ascended the grand staircase, equal partners, beloved and beloved. The girl who inherited nothing had gained everything that truly mattered. And the duke who owned everything had finally found something worth more than all his wealth: love, freely given and joyfully received. In the rose garden beyond the windows, the last light faded from the sky, and the flowers, once dead, now blooming, released their sweetness into the spring night. And so, the girl who inherited nothing discovered she'd inherited everything that truly mattered: love, dignity, and the courage to choose herself. If Evelina and Alexander's journey touched your heart, please show your support by hitting that like button. It helps more people discover these stories of hope and second chances. What did you think of Evelina's transformation, or Alexander's struggle to open his heart? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I love reading every single one, and your insights often inspire future stories. Don't forget to subscribe to Lyra's Romance Stories and ring that notification bell so you never miss a tale of love conquering the odds. Every week, I bring you new historical romances filled with strong heroines, brooding heroes, and the happy endings we all deserve. Up next, you might enjoy The Duke's Daughter Called Her Mummy, and It Made Him Break His Vow Never to Love Again. Just click the cards appearing on your screen now. Until our next story, remember, your worth is not determined by what others give you, but by who you choose to become. Thank you for spending this time with me. Sweet dreams, dear listeners.